Botany Bay. My character was taken then, and I was sent to jail. My friends, they tried to clear me, but nothing would prevail. 'Twas at the Old Bailey sessions the judge to me did say, the jury has found you guilty, you must go to Botany Bay.
This is the Old Bailey, the Central Criminal Court in London. There's been a court here for more than 500 years, and 200 years ago there was a prison here as well, the dreaded Newgate Jail. Now, most people know that Australia was settled by British convicts, but few people realise that those men, women and children were convicted here. Nobody was yet thinking about Australia in this place 200 years ago. Past the grim facade of Newgate and down the street, the Old Bailey Court is in session, and a judge is sentencing muggers and petty thieves according to the harsh laws of England.
Joseph Thomas, indicted at the Old Bailey, October 1782, for feloniously assaulting Mary Pullen on the King's Highway, putting her in fear and taking from her person and against her will 1 silk handkerchief value 2 shillings. Guilty, sentenced to death. Broad Mary, no occupation, indicted for feloniously assaulting Agnes Lakeman, spinster. Found guilty of highway robbery, sentenced to be hanged. Hilt William, indicted for feloniously breaking and entering the dwelling house of Agnes Roberts' widow, about 3 in the afternoon, no person being therein, and stealing thereout 1 silk purse, value 6 and 9 guineas, value £9 and 9 shillings. Guilty, housebreaking, to be hanged.
As these petty criminals were led away from the dock and fitted with iron chains, they had no idea that they would one day go to Australia. Their one remaining hope was to receive the King's mercy and a reprieve to a lighter sentence. But in all probability, they would be hanged. Nowadays, it takes a place with a sense of the macabre to help imagine the convict's point of view. 18th century punishment had only progressed a short step from the horrible world of medieval cruelty. Branding, stone crushing and thumbscrews were tortures still in common use, so the condemned prisoner might be just as frightened but not as surprised as we would be. After all, there were over 200 offences punishable by death, and far more people were hanged for stealing than for murder. Everyone had seen corpses hung up to rot in public as a further warning. They were one of the sights you pointed out to your wife while riding in the park. The fate of criminals was popular gossip. There was a crime magazine of the day, the Malefactors Register or Newgate and Tyburn Calendar, with illustrated accounts of daring felonies and famous criminals who had been caught red-handed. For years, the public followed to see them die at Tyburn, but the carnival atmosphere had recently become so unmanageable that it had been stopped. In fact, a public hanging tree like this one still stood at Tyburn in the 1780s, where Marble Arch now is, although most condemned men and women prisoners of London were hanged in Newgate Prison. Newgate was the flagship of a dozen prisons in London, fearfully decorated with a garland of chains. These very formidable gates are the actual gates of Newgate Prison, preserved in the London Museum. Once inside these gates, there are very few ways out. But many prisoners spent years in here, not knowing exactly what their fate would be. Hoping for a reprieve, a convict tried to survive the cold and filthy conditions of captivity. The prison was getting more and more overcrowded, with young and old, debtors and criminals, sick and healthy, all thrown in together. Every 6 weeks there was a hanging day, and the condemned were put around a coffin in the prison chapel for a last sermon. Outside, a crowd of some 60,000 spectators gathered. The wealthy ones paid for a good view. As many as 19 people were hanged at once, but thanks to the new trapdoor method, the show was short. In 1786 to 87, 155 criminals were hanged at Newgate, but others, including our convicts, who would one day go to Australia, had been reprieved or sentenced directly to transportation beyond the seas, most for 7 years. This might be better than death, but it would mean being shipped in chains into exile, perhaps to Africa, where the climate or natives could kill them, or perhaps to the American colonies, where they would be sold to settlers to work like slaves for the term of their sentence. 40,000 had been sent to America during the previous 70 years, but now there was a problem, which the law was slow to acknowledge.
2 iron grapplings, the goods of the king, found guilty, sentenced to be transported to America for 7 years.
The problem was that the king no longer ruled America, and America would no longer take British convicts. The American War of Independence was bad enough for England, but when France, Spain and Holland joined in against her, it became a world war, and matters were very serious indeed. By 1783, the American colonies were lost and an uneasy peace signed with France, Spain and Holland. Britain was deeply in debt. The remains of empire, particularly in India, were weak and vulnerable. The Navy had been at sea for the better part of 7 years, and although the ships had been patched up between battles, which had ranged from the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean, many of them were permanently damaged or worn out. The stripped-down hulks of some of these redundant ships were now turned into floating prisons to relieve the overcrowded prisons on land.
Broad Mary, occupation none, tried at Exeter, March 1786, indicted for feloniously assaulting Agnes Lakeman, spinster, guilty, reprieved to be transported for 7 years.
The queue of convicted criminals was getting longer all the time. So far, they had cheated the hangman and survived prison. Half-starved, their clothes in rags, they were led away from Newgate in chains. Down the River Thames, the hulks waited to test their endurance still further.
Hudson John, aged 9 years, occupation sometimes a chimney sweeper. Indicted for burglary to be transported for 7 years.
It is impossible to imagine a more unhealthy place to keep prisoners than the hulks. Conditions were brutal, damp, dark, cold and deadly. Many would not live to be transported anywhere.
Guilty, reprieved to be transported for life.
In the winter months of 1786, on one hulk alone, 60 men died. Their bodies were dumped in the river. Yet incredibly, some did survive.
Come all young men of learning, a warning take by me. I'll have you quit night walking and shun bad company. I'll have you quit night walking, or else you'll brew the day, and you will be transported and be sent to Botany Bay. My character was taken and I was sent to jail. My friends, they tried to clean me, but nothing would prevail. 'Twas at the Old Bailey sessions the judge to me did say, the jury has
good time world of wealth, from commerce, banking and land, continued more or less unconcerned by the bursting prisons and the hulks. The rich went to the theatre to see the latest plays. They ate well and lived promiscuously. The laws, after all, were designed to preserve their fashionable world from thieves.
Nichols Jordan, occupation servant to and hair merchant and perfumer, was indicted for feloniously stealing 6 powder puffs, value 48 shillings, 48 hanks of silk, value 7 shillings, 22 boxes of soap, value 2 shillings, 19 pounds weight of hair powder, value 10 shillings, 36 yards of wig ribbon, value 10 shillings, 1 hat brush, value 6pence, guilty, transported for 7 years to Africa.
In the end, it was to be Australia for John Nichols, perhaps a thief because he hated his master, or simply being poor. There were thousands like him, and worse, down the teeming streets and markets of London. The city was full of poor migrants in search of work. Petticoat Lane in London's East End is still a melting pot of people from all over the world. But 200 years ago, the mix was different and the conditions much harsher. Farmland enclosure and the beginning of the Industrial Revolution had forced English peasants into the city. Irish immigrants were job hunting. So were 84,000 unemployed seamen, laid off after the American War. There simply wasn't enough work. Crime was a means to survive, and cheap gin the way to forget for a while. Drunk for a penny, dead drunk for 2pence was the slogan. In the opinion of the prosperous, the poor had brought their misery upon themselves by laziness, drunkenness and moral failure. Few people were enlightened enough to question whether the poor had any choice in the matter. The bankers and merchants of London believed that God was on their side. They built churches to glorify their Christian principles and themselves. But the crime wave in the streets, the unhealthy stench of the prisons and the hulks could not be ignored indefinitely. The convicts were a problem. The opposition was raising the issue, giving the government a hard time in the House of Commons.
The honourable member cannot ignore this problem any longer.
Edmund Burke accused the government of wasting £20,000 a year running the hulks. He demanded that a new place for transportation be found as soon as possible. But William Pitt, aged 23, the youngest Prime Minister England had ever had, was concerned with wider strategy. He had to repair the nation's economy after a disastrous war, rebuild an empire, and above all else, strengthen the navy. To achieve these ends, Pitt had surrounded himself with a close circle of trusted advisers, professional civil servants rather than politicians. One of them was Sir Charles Middleton, comptroller of the naval shipyards, and when he could, Pitt would slip down to the river to see him in person. Together, they would check the work in progress. These on-the-spot visits kept Pitt very well informed. He knew when ships were nearing completion and precisely how much the raw materials had cost. Tons of timber and miles of rope were involved, most of it imported. Multiplied by all the naval yards in England, which employed 6,000 men, it was a very expensive business. But Pitt was convinced that recovery of trade and empire in the Caribbean, Africa and India depended on naval protection from a position of strength. King George III had appointed Pitt to repair the national economy after the American War. For him too, unemployment and crime were less important than economic strategy. Looking at the well-ordered ceremonial of the monarchy today, it's hard to remember how different things were in the reign of George III. Then, the king exercised real political power and was much more vulnerable to the public reaction. On his way to open Parliament, the king was attacked by an angry mob, protesting the cost of food. His coach was badly damaged. The mob was not always disorganised. There were spokesmen and meetings. A revolution, as was soon to erupt in France, might have happened in England. The threat was real. In the early 1780s, a mob had run amok in London for 5 days and nights, setting fire to the prisons, burning and looting private houses. The damage was 10 times as great as that later done in Paris by the French Revolution. Social problems like these filled the jails, alarmed the king, and forced Pitt to act on the convict problem. The settlers of Canada and the Caribbean islands had refused to take convicts, so Pitt turned his attention to Africa. The government considered sending the convicts to an island up the Gambia River, but then realised that the climate, or natives, would kill them. A naval expedition was sent to check Botany Bay in southwest Africa, but there the news was just as bad. The country inland was found to be a desert. Gradually, the most remote possibility of all moved up to first choice. Only 18 years before, Captain Cook had charted the missing coast of this continent, named New Holland by earlier Dutch explorers. He called the east coast New South Wales and found the natives peaceful and the climate excellent. After 8 days, in a place he named Botany Bay, Cook observed that it would be ideal for European settlers. Pitt checked with Sir Joseph Banks, who had been Cook's expedition botanist. Banks enthusiastically agreed that Botany Bay was ideal. An American called Matra had also suggested it, and he had given the idea some thought. So the Prime Minister, William Pitt, made the decision while living here at number 10 on August the 19th, 1786, thus setting into motion the wheels of government, because that decision then had to be implemented by the Treasury, the Home Office and the Admiralty. The Navy was to be responsible for the safe conduct of the expedition and the founding of a settlement. But the Lords of the Admiralty had to swallow the Home Secretary Lord Sydney's choice of a leader.
Eh? Who is this Philip?
Fortunately, they did so, because Sydney selected the ideal man for the job. Captain Arthur Phillip, a veteran of the American War, had been a spy for the Admiralty in France, and between tours of naval duty was a successful farmer. Above all, he was a man of humanity and thoroughness. First, he did his homework. And in this funny old cardboard box at the Public Record Office in London are kept the original documents relating to New South Wales. There was nothing before, but these are the first letters ever written. This, for example, is the first proposal of all. It suggests that a settlement at Botany Bay would flourish and in time atone for the loss of the American colonies. James Matra, an American who had lost everything by remaining loyal to the king, sent this to Sir Joseph Banks and to the government. But Matra and the Loyalists were ignored when the decision was made. The government instructed Arthur Phillip, Captain General and Governor-in-Chief, to transport convicts to New South Wales, there to claim the territory and found a penal colony. This is the original, signed by King George III, and it's full of second thoughts and changes, but it is the original document authorising the creation of a government in New South Wales. The laws of England would prevail in this transplanted society, but it must endeavour by every means possible to live in amity with the natives. This instruction manual was Phillip's authority, and it's full of all the do's and don'ts for a governor administering a penal colony at the other end of the earth. A voyage of 15,500 miles from England. Phillip knew that he would need 10 or 11 ships, To lead such a fleet so far, he had to have the best possible supporting officers. Captain John Hunter volunteered as his second-in-command. A veteran of the American War, Hunter was very highly regarded as a navigator, hydrographer and seaman. Lieutenant Philip Gidley King, my great-great-great-grandfather, who was Philip's personal assistant, or aide-de-camp, was an old friend and another veteran of the American War. These men and the other naval officers were highly trained and would be equipped with the best navigational instruments available, in particular one of the new marine chronometers. With this, they would be able to pinpoint their longitude as well as latitude. So the fleet organisation was to have naval officers in charge, 2 companies of marines responsible for controlling the convicts, mates and boatswains whose orders actually sailed the ships because they were in charge of the riffraff of ordinary seamen whose lives were more alcoholic but no more comfortable than the convicts. Most of these men were veterans who had served on board the huge fighting ships of the line, like HMS Victory. But far from a ship of the line, the expedition flagship was to be a converted store ship, quickly renamed HMS Sirius, with a tiny naval tender in support, the brig HMS Supply. More than 500 people lived on this lower gun deck of HMS Victory. Our HMS Sirius was a quarter of the size, but she still carried 20 guns just like these to defend the fleet against any potential Dutch or French threat. So the guns and expertise of King George's Royal Navy would protect and guide the fleet, but the Navy could not spare all the necessary ships. That would be too expensive. To economise, the government decided to invite commercial vessels to tender for the job of transportation. A business incentive was provided through a deal with the East India Company, which allowed these ships to go on from Botany Bay to China. There they would collect profitable cargoes of tea before returning to London. 9 ships were chosen under these terms: Alexander, Scarborough, Lady Penrhyn, Friendship, Charlotte, Prince of Wales, Golden Grove, Fishbourne, and one other, called Borrowdale. The ships chartered by the Navy for the voyage included a variety of commercial square riggers like this one, 300 tons, 105 feet, length on deck. But instead of the usual cargo, for this voyage, of course, they took 150 convicts. This tiny deck space was the only room for the convicts, for the 20 Marines assigned to each ship and the 30 members of the crew. Once the commercial ships were hired, they were converted into prisons with thick bulkheads and strong iron bars to make escape as difficult as possible. With marine guards stationed at every hatchway and plenty of iron chains to restrain the more troublesome, the convicts would be secure enough down here. As to their conditions, a London publication called the Gentleman's Magazine started a rumour that they would be transported in luxury. But bare boards in a damp, dark space, cold in English waters, hot and airless in the tropics, could hardly be called luxury. Before the first convicts could be loaded aboard, there was a great deal of repair work to be done. The ships were nowhere near seaworthy for a 24,000-kilometre voyage. While Philip argued with the Admiralty for more money and resources, the work proceeded amid the hurly-burly of Thames shipping. The government had imagined the fleet would be ready in 10 weeks. In fact, it took 3 months even to complete repairs. But during December 1786, one by one, the ships started moving down the Thames for loading. One of their first stops was at Deptford, where they took on board part of their allocation of rum from an Admiralty victualling warehouse. In addition to this warehouse, right along the Thames there were many other warehouses supplying Philip with all the goods and supplies that he needed to make the fleet self-sufficient for 2 years. In order to do that, he took a long shopping list with him, which included stockings, 327 pairs for the women, seed and plants, 700 iron shovels, 747,000 nails, 40 wheelbarrows, 12 ploughs, 14 fishing nets, 50 pickaxes, 10,000 bricks, 40 tents for women convicts, 200 canvas beds, 589 women's petticoats, 600 pounds of sugar, Bibles, prayer books, and 300 gallons of brandy. By the first week in January 1787, the fleet had travelled down the Thames as far as Woolwich, where the London hulks were moored. Here, the first 200 convicts were loaded. Many of these survivors were so weak and sick they had to be carried on board. Much remained to be done. More supplies and more convicts would have to be loaded at Portsmouth. Phillip was still struggling with the authorities in London, but at last the venture was moving. Many on board would never see London again. Then, the busiest port and city in the world.
Farewell to old London forever. Farewell to my rum pals as well. Farewell to the well-known Old Bailey, where I used for to cut such a swell. Singing to a lie-o-lie-o-lie-o-lie, singing to a lie-o-lie-o-lie, singing to a lie-o-lie-o-lie, we're bound for Botany Bay. Now all of my duties and duchesses, take warning from what I've to say. Mind what is your own that you touchesses, or you'll find us in Botany Bay.
At the halt. 1, 2.
The sailors bound for Botany Bay were a godsend to the alehouses and women of Portsmouth. This was their last chance to let off steam in England for 2 years. Even some of the officers got swept away. The attractions of the town were so strong that it wasn't easy keeping the sailors on board ship. Even the threat of a flogging failed to stop them slipping ashore. The Navy was used to the problem. Traditionally, solved it with a regular allowance of alcohol.
Carry on.
Up, spirits! Take it all out.
But as the fleet was delayed, waiting for convicts, waiting for Phillip, even the rations of rum and water, called grog, were not enough to prevent trouble. Some of the sailors actually went on strike for a pay advance to spend on shore. Trouble was also brewing among the Marines, who were worried that their liquor might run out.
8 men, 9 men, sir.
If it's going to take us 9 months to get down there, it's going to take them 9 months to get back, then 9 months to get out there again for rations, right? Because there's nothing there except scavengers.
The Marines were satisfied when it was agreed to load 3 years' supply of rum. People in Portsmouth just wished the fleet would go away, taking the drunken sailors and festering cargo. 16 bodies had been found in the harbour, the result of a fever epidemic on one of the convict ships. It was under control, but naval officers were running out of excuses. Then, at long last, Phillip's haggling with the government in London began to bear fruit. Things started to move again. More convicts were taken aboard and the last supplies were being loaded. After 4 months' delay, the time was coming to say farewell.
Yet I do concern myself.
The sailors would be gone for at least 2 years. As for the convicts sentenced to 7 or 14 years or life, they had little chance to say goodbyes. Once they left Portsmouth, they would probably never see their loved ones or England again. This is the Sally Port and the old wall of Portsmouth, the arch through which many of the convicts passed on their way to the ships that were waiting on the Solent. 200 convicts taken on board during the first week in May brought the total to 759. Finally, Phillip arrived from London, and on May the 13th, 1787, without ceremony, the First Fleet was ready to leave.
Farewell to old England forever. Farewell to my rum pals as well. Farewell to the well-known Old Bailey, where I used for to cut such a swell. Singing to a lie, you a lie-edity. Singing to a lie, you a lie. Singing to a lie, you a lie-edity. Oh, we're bound for Botany Bay.
Phillip had problems keeping 11 ships together, but in general, everybody felt better once the fleet was at sea. In particular, the convicts perked up as the ships headed south towards the Canary Islands. Before long, the medical attention of the Navy surgeons, the vastly improved diet and the fact that Phillip released them from their chains all led to trouble. A convict mutiny was quelled on board the Scarborough. There were good and bad ships, but those naval and marine officers who kept journals recorded several floggings and quarrels before the volcanic peak of Tenerife hove into sight, the first port of call after 3 weeks at sea. Tenerife was and is a Spanish port, and relations between the Spanish and the British were strained following the American War. Nevertheless, the fleet got a warm reception, and arrangements were made for Phillip to buy what supplies the island could offer. This is a hard place to grow much at the best of times, and Phillip had 1,350 mouths to feed. Long-term supplies had to be conserved. Greens and fruit were needed regularly to prevent scurvy. The fleet found only onions available. At least they could fill up with water. It took only a week before they set off once more. This time for a much longer voyage down across the Atlantic. New problems soon arose. This time it was the sailors who went on strike, refusing to work aloft until their rations were improved. It turned out they wanted more, not for themselves, but to buy favours from the convict women. Below decks, there was a shady traffic going on through holes made in the bulkheads, and several children would later be born as a result. Naval officers sorted out the dispute, and a marine involved was punished on board the flagship with 300 lashes. The women convicts continued troublesome and abusive, but the fleet pressed on. For a while, Phillip was worried about their slow progress and reduced the water ration to 3 pints a day, dangerously little in the tropics. They picked up speed, however, and on the 3rd of August, the fleet dropped anchor outside the harbour of Rio de Janeiro. After 9 weeks at sea, the members of the fleet were both relieved and excited to see Rio's Sugarloaf Mountain. Unfortunately, however, the winds then set in against them, and for 4 days they had to stand off at sea, waiting for the winds to change so that they could enter the harbour mouth. Lieutenant Raper painted the view. Modern Rio looks rather different. although tucked away at the foot of the towers is the old palace. Captain Phillip was made welcome here by the Portuguese viceroy, governor of what was then the colony of Brazil. Phillip's service in the Portuguese Navy was remembered, and the fleet was treated to an island in the harbour called Enxadas as their headquarters. The convicts were kept on board, but once Enxadas was set up, the officers could go ashore to explore the city, then a thriving slave market. The very first landmark the officers of the First Fleet saw when they came ashore was this monument, the drinking fountain of Master Valentino, now in the heart of Rio, and in those days supplied with fresh water from the hills along an aqueduct. The ships were filled up with water from this source. The next urgent necessity for the fleet personnel was fruit to counteract scurvy, and in this Rio was bountiful. The convicts were given a bonus of 10 oranges each. While the supply work went on, some of the officers admired the city churches and stood amazed, from their Protestant point of view, at the religious zeal and huge crowds at local Catholic festivals. Amorous adventures were not easy to come by. At least the officers had little success. The seamen and marines, however, when their turn to go on shore came, did rather better. But then they were not so choosy or so bound by decorum. They went to have a riotously good time. The Marines, the keepers of the convicts, got into a lot of trouble. Drinking too much, womanising, stealing, fighting, passing off counterfeit coins made by the convicts, and deserting. And when they were caught, they were normally clapped into the local Portuguese prison. The Portuguese then simply handed them back to the fleet authorities, who court-martialled them and gave out sentences of 200 or 300 lashes. The fleet left again with a relatively clean sheet, heading east across the South Atlantic in windy weather. The pattern of life at sea soon reasserted itself, with births, deaths, trouble and punishment. Convict Mary Broad bore a daughter in the height of the storm. A couple of convicts fell overboard and were left behind. There was another mutiny attempt, this time on board the Alexander, and the Marines, as usual, were drunk and insubordinate. But in general, the 6-week voyage to the last port of call was reckoned uneventful. On the 13th of October, in clear weather, with a fresh breeze, the fleet furled its sails and came to anchor off Cape Town. After the green hills of Rio, Table Mountain looked dark and forbidding. But Lieutenant Raper painted the scene as the fleet came in. Phillip didn't really want to stop at Cape Town because the port was in the hands of the Dutch, and in particular the Dutch East India Company. Once the fleet dropped anchor in Table Bay, Phillip sent King, the aide-de-camp, ashore to negotiate with the foreigners. Phillip asked King to visit the governor and gain permission for the fleet to remain in Table Bay and to take on all the supplies they needed for the settling of Botany Bay. But Governor Van der Graaf was not at all helpful. The British had tried to take the Cape during the American War, and he knew it would not be long before they tried again. The Dutch East India Company itself was going bankrupt for want of British bank loans, and the company had appointed Van der Graaf. He stalled, saying that there were few supplies available, and that anyway the town council would have to agree to the fleet's request. The council also prevaricated. Phillip decided that the fleet's needs were so urgent that he must find independent merchants willing to do business with him for hard cash. At the house of the De Wet family, he found what he needed. Once the De Wets helped them get permission for supplying the fleet, the De Wets then provided them with the meat, the greens, the fresh fruit, the wines, the brandies, and most importantly of all for the new colonies starting afresh, the seeds that they would need to become self-sufficient in New South Wales. The fleet also bought livestock, which they hoped would breed in the new land. There were always a few live animals on board to be slaughtered and eaten during a voyage. But now they squeezed into the ships 44 sheep, 6 cows, 2 bulls and 28 large hogs. It was a Noah's Ark menagerie, topped up with 1 stallion, 3 mares and 3 colts. To make room, the convicts were rearranged and Phillip even dismantled the guns on board HMS Sirius. After all, the fleet should be safe from any military threat in the empty waters which lay ahead. Every remaining nook and cranny was then stuffed with fruit and veggies. After 3 busy weeks in Cape Town harbour, the fleet finally lumbered away from their last contact with civilization on the 12th of November and fought against the winds around the Cape. They did eventually round the Cape of Good Hope, but they'd lost so much time doing it and eaten into so many of their precious supplies doing it that Phillip decided he'd now have to split up the fleet. So he gathered the fastest ships together, left the heavier ones behind and set off as quickly as he could for the long run down to Botany Bay. Now they were really on their own, beyond the routes plied by other ships, beyond the means of sending dispatches or receiving news, heading day by day towards the violent storms of the roaring 40s. Officers began to get seasick, let alone the convicts below decks. Soon, the animals were being thrown about and injured, and sails blown to pieces. Lieutenant Collins managed to scrawl miserably in his diary. All communication with family and friends now cut off. We are leaving the world behind us to enter on a state unknown. Indeed, the heart of Australia was unknown. No explorer had been more than about 5 miles inland. From the coast, Cook and Banks had reported strange plants, which grew nowhere else on Earth, and even stranger animals. All London had vaguely heard of the kangaroo. Cook and Banks had also observed the natives. To Cook, the Aborigines seemed fearless but timorous and inoffensive, though Banks thought they might have frequent wars. Cook said they may appear to some to be the most wretched people on Earth, but in reality they are far more happier than we Europeans. They seemed to set no value on anything we gave them. All they seemed to want was for us to be gone. But now, after 18 years, the British were returning to claim the land in the name of King George III and to found a settlement for their convicts.
I tell you freely now, I shall recommend you as objects of mercy. But your characters, I'm sure, are bad. Therefore, the utmost that you can expect is to be sent abroad.
Inexorably, the fleet sailed closer to their goal. Despite 2 months of navigating through storms, they knew precisely where they were, and rounded the tip of Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania, on January the 3rd. Then, turning north and struggling against the winds, they headed for Botany Bay. On January the 14th, 1788, HMS Supply and the leading division of the fleet arrived off the Heads, but the winds prevented them getting into the bay for 4 days. By the time the wind changed, the second division of the fleet had arrived and they all went in more or less together. Lieutenant Bradley painted them doing so. Botany Bay, which Cook and Banks had described as a place with a fine climate, soil fit for the cultivation of all sorts of European crops and plenty of water. But once on shore, Phillip and his officers looked and were appalled. The anchorage was poor, the soil sandy, and above all, there was very little water. For a while, it looked as if the whole venture could be a disaster. There had to be somewhere better. While the fleet waited anxiously, Phillip set off northwards to check on the inlet which Cook had named Port Jackson but not entered. To everyone's relief, he returned 3 days later with the news that Port Jackson was the finest harbour in the world. The fleet set off immediately. Then, at the very mouth of the bay, 2 large ships were sighted. For a moment, they were amazed, and then concerned. The ships flew French colours. Fortunately, they turned out to be a friendly scientific expedition under Jean de la Pérouse. Phillip greeted him with a sigh of relief, then pressed on. There was no time to lose. It was now 9 weeks since leaving Cape Town. Water was running out and fresh food had gone long ago. Everyone was hungry for the land. After the disappointment of Botany Bay, Port Jackson offered hope for a settlement only a short distance up the coast. On the 26th of January, Bradley painted the fleet at its journey's end. On a voyage of 8.5 months since leaving Portsmouth, not one ship had been lost. Here was the finest harbour in the world, which Phillip would rename Sydney after the Home Secretary back in London who had given him command. Sydney, where today, on the 26th of January, modern Australians, some of them descended from people who arrived on the first fleet that day, 200 years ago, reenact the historic arrival. The naval officers and marines came ashore in boats, with their uniforms, their shoes, their wigs and hats, with their muskets, their discipline, their memories of England, and their proclamation claiming Australia for God and their King. On that day, 200 years ago, the Aborigines melted away into the bush, but today it's another matter.
The Aborigine owns this country! Is this all it takes to get a country? Bring a boat on and plant a flag! You know who owns this country, judges! Judges, eh? What about land rights for the blacks? You talk it all and won't give any back!
In a sense, all it did take to own Australia was to plant a flag and establish a government. But surviving was not so easy, especially as the first settlers learned so little from the Aborigines. They began by clearing the ground and planting European crops. Phillip was an experienced farmer, but few of the other naval officers, marines or convicts had any useful knowledge. And it was touch and go for nearly 3 years before the first settlement was secure. But that is another story.
Farewell to old London forever. Farewell to my rum pals as well. Farewell to the well-known Old Bailey, where I used for to catch such a swell. Singing to a lie-o-lie-o-lie-o-lie-o-lie. Singing to a lie-o-lie-o-lie-o-lie. Singing to a lie-o-lie-o-lie. Singing to a lie, you a lie at a tea. Singing to a lie, you a la da da da.